the summer Ida Vance turned 22. She buried her father on a Tuesday and received the letter on a Thursday, and she always thought that said everything about how the world worked. The letter was from a man she'd never met, written in spare, careful handwriting that looked like someone who'd learned penmanship from necessity rather than pleasure. His name was Callum. No, wait. She crossed that out in her mind. The name at the bottom of the page was Bennett Hare, rancher, near Drumheller, Alberta. He had 3 children. His wife had died 14 months prior. He needed a housekeeper, possibly more, the letter said, and then went quiet on what more meant, the way men did when they wanted something but couldn't bring themselves to ask for it plainly. Her uncle Dermot had arranged it, not cruelly. Dermot wasn't a cruel man, just a practical one. He'd taken Ida in after her mother passed when she was 9, had fed and clothed her for 13 years without complaint. And now there was the matter of his own debts. The ones Ida's father had co-signed and left behind like old furniture nobody wanted. Dermot sat across from her at the kitchen table in Lethbridge with his hat in his hands and said, "It's a decent arrangement, Ida, better than most girls get." She didn't argue. There wasn't a word she could have said that would have changed anything, and she'd long since learned which fights were worth the bruising. She packed everything she owned into a carpet bag, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of pins, and the letter, and took the morning coach east into the badlands. The landscape changed fast once you left the city. The green bled out of everything. The coulees opened up around the road like the earth had cracked apart and never quite healed, and the sky got bigger than seemed reasonable, pale and hot and wide in a way that made Ida feel very small and very exposed. She pressed her face to the window and told herself this was fine. She had survived worse. She wasn't sure that was true, but it helped to say it. Bennett Hare's ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that took 40 minutes to drive in a borrowed buggy from the nearest town. The man who drove her barely spoke, which she appreciated. When the ranch came into view, low house, big barn, a water trough, and 3 outbuildings, she felt her stomach do something unpleasant. It wasn't that it looked terrible, it just looked so permanent, like the kind of place that either held you together or ground you down, with very little in between. Bennett was standing by the fence when they pulled up. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been made for harder times than these. He watched the buggy come up the road with his arms folded across his chest and an expression she couldn't read. Not hostile, not warm, just waiting. The driver hopped down and helped with her bag without being asked. Bennett walked over unhurried. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Hare." She kept her voice level. He looked at her for a moment, not the way some men looked at women, cataloging and assessing, more the way you'd look at a patch of sky when you were trying to figure out whether the weather was going to hold. Then he nodded once, picked up her bag and turned toward the house. "Children are inside," he said. "I'll let you find your feet before I put you to work." It wasn't welcoming exactly, but it wasn't unkind. She followed him in. The house was dim and smelled like wood smoke and something that had been cooking too long. It was clean enough, in the way that places got clean when someone was trying very hard without quite enough hands. The floors were swept, the dishes were done. But there was a tiredness to everything, a sense that things were being maintained rather than lived in. 3 children stood in the middle of the main room watching her arrive. The oldest was a girl of about 12, Laurel, she'd learn later, with her father's dark eyes and the particular stillness of a child who'd had to grow up sideways. She stood with her arms at her sides and her chin up, not defiant exactly, but braced. Behind her was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, with a spray of freckles across his nose and hair that needed cutting. He was fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve and looking at Ida with more open curiosity than his sister allowed herself. His name was Orion, though everyone called him Ori. And then there was the smallest one, pressed half behind Laurel's arm. A girl 4 years old, with pale hair cut blunt at the chin and eyes that were too serious for her face. Her name was Maisie, and she said nothing at all, just looked at Ida with an expression that was somehow both entirely unreadable and completely heartbreaking. "I'm Ida," she said to all 3 of them, because it seemed like the right place to start. Laurel's chin lifted a fraction higher. "We know," Ida nodded. "All right then." Bennett showed her to a small room off the back of the house, a cot, a chest of drawers, a single window that looked out at the coulee. He set her bag down on the floor. "Supper's usually at 6, he said. "Whatever needs doing before then is yours to figure out." He left. Ida sat on the edge of the cot and looked at her hands for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the children moving through the house, the low murmur of Laurel giving Ori some instruction she couldn't make out. A door opened and closed. The wind picked up outside. She got up, straightened her dress, and went to find the kitchen. The first weeks were nothing but work. She woke before dawn and rebuilt the fire, the way she'd done her whole life, And then she made breakfast and set the children to their chores and hauled water and mended things and cooked supper and washed the dishes and fell into the cot each night, so tired she didn't dream. Bennett worked from first light until after dark and came inside only to eat, and even then he seemed to be somewhere else in his head, only half present at the table, his eyes distant. He wasn't unkind. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He wasn't unkind. He thanked her for meals quietly and without looking up. He fixed the broken hinge on her bedroom door without her asking. He was simply absent in a way that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with whatever he was still carrying from before she got here. Ida understood that. She didn't push. Laurel was the harder problem. The girl watched her constantly, from across the room, from the doorway, from out in the yard, watching with those still dark eyes, cataloging everything Ida did and said and decided. She wasn't rude, not exactly, but she was precise with her coldness in a way that reminded Ida of someone who'd taught herself to be careful, because it was the only protection she had. One morning, Ida found her out by the woodpile trying to split logs that were too heavy for her. She'd been at it a while. Her arms were shaking with the effort, and her hair was plastered to her forehead. "Let me help," Ida said. "I don't need it." Laurel brought the axe down again, awkwardly, and the log rolled off to the side. "Okay," Ida said, and sat down on the chopping block and waited. Laurel tried twice more. Then she stopped, breathing hard, and looked at Ida with something dangerous in her expression. Not tears, just the place right before tears that some people never let themselves cross. "Why are you here?" she said. "Your father needed help. That's not why." Ida looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean you didn't choose to come here. Nobody told me exactly, but I figured it out. You came because someone made you. So why are you acting like it was your idea?" Ida was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because it doesn't matter anymore how it started. I'm here now, and this is where I am." Laurel's jaw tightened. She looked away. "She used to split the wood herself," Laurel said, quieter. "Mama, she said it was faster than asking Papa." Ida didn't say anything. She waited. "She's been gone 14 months, Laurel said. "Not that anyone's counting." She picked up the axe and handed it to Ida without another word, then walked back toward the house. Ida split the wood. Ori was easier, the way younger children sometimes were, more curious than cautious, not yet sure what it cost to let someone in. He started appearing beside her while she worked, not asking to help, just being there. Watching her patch Maisie's coat or bread the chicken for supper, asking questions that had nothing to do with anything. Had she ever seen a real bear? Was it true that certain birds could navigate by the stars? What did she think about whether fish felt cold? She answered all of them as seriously as he asked them. He seemed to appreciate that. Maisie was the mystery. The little girl didn't speak. Not a word. Not since Ida arrived. She moved through the house like light through water, present but not quite solid. She ate what was put in front of her. She went to bed when she was told. She clutched a small wooden horse carved rough and plain, its legs uneven, clearly made by someone who'd tried hard without quite having the skill. One night Ida woke to a sound she couldn't name at first. She lay still and listened. It was coming from down the hall, rhythmic, low. When she finally got up and followed it, she found Maisie sitting on the floor outside her parents' room, her back against the wall, rocking herself slowly. Ida sat down beside her on the floor without saying anything. Maisie looked at her. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in her face that was worse than crying. "Bad night?" Ida said softly. Maisie looked at the door to her father's room. "She's not in there," Ida said, not unkindly. "I know." Maisie's hand tightened around the little horse. "Can I sit here with you for a bit?" Ida asked. Maisie didn't move away. Ida took that as yes. They sat on the floor in the dark hallway until the little girl's head started drooping. And then Ida carried her back to bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, until Maisie's breathing slowed into sleep. When Ida finally stood to go, a small hand reached out and caught the hem of her nightgown. She sat back down. She stayed until dawn. September came cold and early that year. The mornings had frost in them by the second week, and by the end of the month the nights were genuinely bitter. The ranch was holding, barely. Ida could see it in the numbers Bennett left on the table sometimes, ledgers he didn't hide but didn't explain either, as if he just needed them somewhere other than inside his own head. The grazing had been poor that summer. 2 horses had been sold. There was less put by than there should have been for winter. Ida didn't ask. She watched and she listened and she started stretching every meal a little further than it strictly did to go. Bennett noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, but he started coming in from the barn a few minutes earlier each evening, staying at the table a bit longer after supper was done. Not talking exactly, just present in a way he hadn't been before. One evening she was mending by the fire when he came in and sat across from her and picked up a piece of harness that needed work. They sat in silence for a long time. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that had something in it. You're good with them, Bennett said without looking up from his work. Ida didn't answer right away. Ori's easy. Maisie's. She stopped. She's getting there. Laurel? Laurel is doing what she needs to do to protect herself. She paused. I can respect that. Bennett's hands stilled on the harness. Something moved across his face and was gone. Her mother was like that, he said. Careful. Didn't trust easy. Smart. He went back to his work. Yeah, it was. They didn't speak again that night. But the next morning, Bennett was still at the table when the children came down for breakfast, which hadn't happened before. And when Laurel came in and saw him sitting there, she stopped in the doorway with a look on her face that Ida wasn't sure she was supposed to see. The sickness came in October. It started with Maisie, a cough that Ida noticed on a Monday and that had turned into a fever by Wednesday. By Thursday, the little girl was burning up, her skin hot and papery, her breathing shallow. Bennett rode into Drumheller for the doctor, but the roads had turned to mud from the fall rains, and by the time he got back, the doctor had already been called out to the other side of the county. 2 days, maybe 3, the message said. Ida didn't wait. She moved into Maisie's room. She sponged the fever down every 2 hours, made broth, and coaxed it past the little girl's cracked lips, sat through the long nights when Maisie's breathing went ragged, and her temperature climbed, and every instinct Ida had said, push harder, don't stop, don't let her slip. Laurel stood in the doorway on the second night. She'd been standing there for a while before Ida noticed her. Is she going to be all right? Laurel's voice came out very young. Ida looked up. Yes, you don't know that? No, Ida said, but I'm not going to let anything happen to her. Laurel stood there a moment longer. Then she turned and went back to her room. But an hour later she returned with a cup of tea she'd made herself, set it on the bedside table without a word, and went back out. Ida drank it. It was too strong and slightly burnt, and it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. On the 4th day, Maisie's fever broke. She opened her eyes mid-morning and looked at Ida and said in a voice like something small and rusty, I'm thirsty. Ida's eyes burned. She got the water. When Bennett came in to check on them that afternoon, Maisie was sitting up in bed eating porridge and explaining to her wooden horse why it wasn't allowed to sleep in the bowl. Bennett crouched down by the bedside and put his hand on his daughter's forehead, and the look on his face in that moment was something Ida knew she'd carry with her for a long time. He stood and looked at Ida. His eyes were red. Thank you, he said. It came out rough, like he'd had to reach somewhere deep to find it. She did most of the work, Ida said. Something shifted in his expression, not the usual distance. Something that was trying, awkwardly and not quite successfully, to get closer. The next morning there was a new pair of gloves outside her bedroom door. Good ones, lined, the kind that kept out the November cold. No note. She put them on before she started the fire. They fit perfectly. The incident with Laurel and the east pasture fence happened in early November, and it pulled something loose in the house that had been held tight too long. Bennett had asked Ori to check the fence line, a job too big for a 10-year-old really, but Ori had begged for real work, and Bennett had given it to him in good faith. What they hadn't counted on was Laurel following, and the bull that had gotten through from the Harwood farm down the road, and the way a 12-year-old girl with her father's stubbornness and none of his experience might decide to handle a loose bull on her own rather than run back for help. Ida was hanging laundry when she heard Ori screaming for his father. She got there before Bennett did. Laurel was on the wrong side of the fence from the bull, not injured, not in danger now, but trembling and white-lipped, having apparently herded the animal back through a gap in the fence through some combination of noise and nerve that Ida couldn't quite reconstruct afterward. Ori was still yelling. Laurel was gripping the fence post with both hands and not looking at anything. Ida climbed the fence and went to her. Are you hurt? No, Lorelei. I said no. But her voice cracked on it, and she finally looked at Ida, and her eyes were wet and furious and terrified all at once. I couldn't just leave it. It could have gotten to the horses. I know. I knew what I was doing. I believe you, Ida said, and meant it. Laurel pressed her mouth together. Her hands were still shaking on the fence post. I hate this, she said very quietly to no one in particular. I hate that there's never enough of us, that there's always too much to do and not enough people to do it. Ida stood beside her and didn't say anything. Sometimes that was what was needed. Bennett arrived at a run, took one look at the situation, and the relief and fury on his face came in about equal measure. He got Laurel off the fence and checked her over and said very little, which Ida now understood was how he handled fear. Later that night, after Ori and Maisie were in bed, she could hear the low murmur of him talking to Laurel through the wall, long and quiet, the way parents talked when they were trying to say something real. Whatever he said, Laurel came to breakfast the next morning with less armor on than usual. She still didn't smile at Ida, but she stopped watching her like she expected to be disappointed. Winter set in hard. The temperature dropped and kept dropping, the kind of cold that Alberta does with a kind of institutional severity. Like it has a point to make. The water pump froze twice. A section of the barn roof needed emergency patching in the middle of a January storm, and Ida helped hold the planks while Bennett nailed them, both of them losing feeling in their hands before the job was done, neither one of them mentioning it. These were the moments, she found, when she learned who Bennett Hare actually was. Not at the table, not in conversation. He wasn't built for conversation, but in work. The steadiness of him, the way he never complained, never wasted motion, never asked anyone to carry something he could carry himself. He was, she thought, a man who had learned that the only way through hard things was straight through them. And he'd been walking that way so long he'd forgotten there were other directions. One evening, she came in to find him sitting at the table with a letter in his hand. He was just holding it, not reading it, staring at the wall. "Everything all right?" she said. He set the letter down. "Bank." Just the one word. She sat across from him. "How bad?" He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not defeat, but the thing right next to it. "Bad enough that I don't have good options. Tell me what the options are." He looked at her for a moment like he wasn't sure she was serious. Then he told her. The ranch was carrying more debt than she'd understood from the ledgers she'd seen. There was a second loan she hadn't known about, taken out when Nora got sick, to cover the medical costs. The grazing income had been short 2 seasons running. If spring wasn't significantly better, he was looking at selling off the north section, which was the best grazing land they had, which would make everything harder going forward. "Is there anyone you could lease the north section to?" Ida said. Bennett frowned. "What?" "Instead of selling it outright. If you lease the grazing rights, you keep the land and still get income from it. You could approach the Harwoods. They've been expanding. They'd probably take the grazing lease for the season." Bennett was quiet for a long time. "And they'd want to negotiate from a position of strength, knowing I need the money." "Yes," Ida said. "So we negotiate first before they know." He looked at her. "You think like that?" "My father was in debt most of my life," she said simply. "You learn." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in him seemed to settle, some held tension going fractionally looser. "All right," he said. "We'll try." She didn't correct the we. February was brutal and long and somehow also quietly the beginning of something. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things. A morning he lingered in the kitchen after breakfast, just to hear the end of the story Ori was telling. The way he'd started asking Ida's opinion on small decisions. What to plant, which fence needed doing first, whether Ori's reading was where it should be. The way when she was sick for 3 days, with a chest cold that laid her flat, she woke to find firewood stacked by her door, and a pot of something on the stove that he'd made himself badly but sincerely. She knew what was happening. She wasn't naive. She also knew he didn't know what to do with it. She found him one evening out past the horse paddock, standing at the edge of the coulee, looking at nothing in particular. There was a simple wooden cross in the ground a few feet away, almost hidden by the yellow grass. She stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to. You're not intruding." His voice was flat but not unkind. She went and stood beside him. "Nora Hare," said the cross with dates too close together. "Ori was 6, Bennett said after a while. Maisie was 2. Maisie doesn't really remember her." "I think she does," Ida said carefully. "Not in pictures, but in her body, in the way she wakes up." Bennett was quiet for a long moment. "She talked all the time," he said. "Nora couldn't get a quiet moment when she was around, and I spent years thinking I'd like one." He paused. "I'd give everything I own for the noise now." Ida didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. They stood there in the cold until the light started to go, and then walked back to the house without speaking. And somehow that felt like more than a lot of words would have. March came in sideways with ice and wind, and then, abruptly, a week of warmth that made everything smell like mud and possibility. The children got louder. Ore started leaving frogs in places they didn't belong. Even Laurel was seen. Ida saw it from the kitchen window, laughing at something Ori did in the yard, quickly and as if she hadn't meant to. Small things. But Ida knew how to count them. The morning everything almost came apart, started with a horse and ended somewhere she hadn't seen coming. One of the mares had foaled early in the night, and the foal was small and struggling. Bennett had been in the barn since before light. Ida brought breakfast out to him, and he ate it standing up without seeming to taste it. She stood beside him and looked at the foal and felt the particular silence of someone waiting to see which way things would go. "Has she nursed?" Ida asked. "A little, not enough." They stood there a while. The barn was warm and smelled like hay and animal and cold morning. "The Harwoods sent word," Bennett said finally, not looking at her. "They'll take the grazing lease. Terms are good." He paused. "Better than I expected. Good. It was your idea. It was the right idea for the situation. He finally looked at her. He stopped, started again. I keep trying to figure out why you stayed. You didn't have to. I know that. Dermot's debt has nothing to do with you, not really. You could have gone where? Ida said plainly. Somewhere. Somewhere that wasn't someone else's problem. Is that what I am to you? A problem? He looked at her. Really looked. The way he almost never did, the distance dropping out of his eyes. No, he said. That's not what you are. She waited. You're the reason this place is still standing, he said. You're the reason my kids eat right and laugh sometimes, and Maisie started talking again. His voice went rough at the edges. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what I'm supposed to. You don't have to do anything, Ida said. You don't have to figure it out on my schedule, Ida. He said her name like it was the only word left. I don't want you to go. I know. He stopped. I mean that I want you to stay. Not because of the children. Not because of the ranch. Something moved across his face, careful and slow and frightened. Because when I come in from a bad day, you're the first person I look for. Because I've been thinking about the future again, which I stopped doing 14 months ago. He looked away, jaw tight. And I don't know if that's fair to you, given what you walked into. Given that you didn't choose any of this. I'm choosing it now, Ida said. He looked at her. That's the only choice that matters, she said. Not how it started. The foal shifted in the hay behind them, and the mare turned her head, and for a moment it was just the sound of the barn settling around them, warm and close. I'm not easy to be with, Bennett said. I noticed. I'm not good at saying things. I noticed that too. Ida looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to be different than you are. I'm just asking you not to pretend I'm not here, he breathed out slowly. Then he reached out very carefully and covered her hand with his where it rested on the stall door. His hand was rough and warm and held on like it was something he'd been working up to for a long time. Stay, he said. Yes, she said. They stood there until the foal found its feet. She told herself she wouldn't cry at the ceremony. She didn't, mostly. The minister in Drumheller was a small, cheerful man who moved through the words like he meant them, and Ida stood beside Bennett in her best dress, dark green wool, carefully pressed, and said what needed to be said, and listened to him say it back in his low, careful voice, and held herself together until Maisie, from her place between Laurel and Ori, said very seriously and very loudly, Is she our mama now? And the minister smiled, and Bennett looked down at his daughter, and something in his face that had been closed for a long time opened up all at once. If she'll have you, he said. She will, Ida said, before anyone could ask. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining the buttons on her dress. Ori started crying and tried to pretend he wasn't. Laurel didn't cry, but she came to Ida afterward and stood very close and didn't move away, which was Ida had learned how Laurel said the things she couldn't say out loud. They had a small supper at the house. Mrs. Harwood brought a pie. The children stayed up too late and fell asleep where they sat, and Bennett carried them to bed one by one. And when he came back, he sat down across from Ida and poured 2 cups of tea and didn't say anything for a while. You know this isn't going to be easy, he said finally. It already isn't, Ida said. There's the debt. The north section. Next winter. I know. I'm not offering you a comfortable life. Ida looked at him across the table, this quiet, difficult, honest man she'd arrived to like a piece of furniture someone had ordered and not yet found a place for. Bennett, I didn't come here looking for comfortable. I came here looking for somewhere that needed me. She paused. I found it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across and took her hand, and they sat like that while the fire burned low, and outside the Alberta dark pressed in around the house, and inside it was warm. Spring came properly in late April, the real kind, with warmth that held and green coming up through the pasture and the creek running fast with snowmelt. Ida planted the kitchen garden. Ori helped mostly by asking questions and occasionally helping. Maisie sat on the fence post and supervised. Even Laurel came out one afternoon and knelt in the dirt and helped put in the bean seeds without being asked. The Harwood lease went through, and the terms were good enough that the bank repayments felt manageable for the first time. Bennett still worked from dawn until dark, but there was less desperation in it now, more intention. He started talking at supper, not much but enough, asking the children about their days, listening when Ori went on about whatever had caught his interest that week. One evening, Ida was in the kitchen when she heard Laurel and Bennett talking in the main room. She wasn't trying to listen, but the house was small and she caught pieces of it. Something about Laurel wanting to go to the school in town properly. Full-time, not just the 2 days a week they'd been managing. Bennett's voice low and uncertain, Laurel's careful but firm. She kept her hands in the bread dough and let them work it out. Later, Bennett appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wants school, he said. I heard. We'd have to board her in town, part of the week. Yes, he rubbed the back of his neck. She's 12. She's 12 and she's been half running this house for 14 months, Ida said. She's earned the right to be a student. He was quiet for a moment. I don't want losing her. You're letting her grow. Ida looked at him. That's what you do when you love someone. You make room for where they're going, not just where they've been. He held her gaze for a long time. Then, when did you get like this? Like what? Right about things. Ida turned back to the dough. I've always been right about things. You're just starting to notice. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She counted it. The summer turned out to be a good one. The grazing held, the garden came in well, and the foal, the one that had struggled on Bennett and Ida's wedding morning, grew into something sturdy and promising that Ori named Copernicus, because that was what Ori was like. Laurel went to the town school 3 days a week and came home full of opinions about mathematics and history, and a girl named Theodora. She couldn't decide whether she liked or not. Maisie learned to read simple words and started carrying a small notebook in her coat pocket to write them down in. She still carried the wooden horse. She still didn't talk a lot, but she talked, and the sound of her voice in the house was something Ida didn't think she'd ever take for granted. One afternoon in August, Ida was in the garden when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the road and looked up to see a man she recognized and had hoped never to see again. Her Uncle Dermot pulled up on a roan she didn't know, looking older and more diminished than she remembered, and took off his hat when he saw her. Ida, he said. She straightened up slowly. Dermot. He looked around the yard with an expression she couldn't quite read. Looks like you're settling in? I am. I heard you married him. Yes. He turned his hat in his hands. He had the look of a man who'd rehearsed something and was now finding it hard to say. I want to apologize, he said finally, for how I handled things. I was in a hard spot and you were the easiest solution, and I knew it wasn't right and I did it anyway. Ida looked at him for a long moment. What do you want me to say, Dermot? Nothing, I suppose. I just needed to say it. The house door opened. Bennett came out and walked across the yard and stood beside Ida without saying anything. Just stood there, which she understood. Dermot looked at him, then back at her. I heard the debt got cleared. Your father's portion. It did good. He nodded. His jaw worked. That's good, Dermot, Ida said. Thank you for coming, and I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell anyone who put me here. I don't carry it against you, but I'm not going to pretend you did me a favor either. He nodded again, slow and accepting, like he'd expected it. He put his hat back on. You always were straight shooting, he said, something almost like pride in it. Your mother's girl. He rode back down the road, and Ida watched him go, and when he was gone the weight she hadn't entirely realized she'd been carrying settled a little lighter. Bennett put his hand on the back of her neck, warm and steady. All right, he said. Yes, she meant it. More than. They went back inside. October came, and with it, the anniversary of Nora's death. Ida had been aware of it getting closer. The shift in Bennett, quieter and more internal. The way Laurel retreated and Ori got louder. The way Maisie started sleeping poorly again. She didn't pretend it wasn't happening. She set an extra place at the table on the anniversary, quietly and without explaining herself, and brought a handful of late wildflowers in from the field and put them in a jar in the middle of the table, and made the meal that Bennett had mentioned once in passing that Nora used to make on Sundays. Nobody said anything about it. But after supper, Laurel went to the shelf in the main room where there was a photograph in a wooden frame. Ida had noticed it, never touched it, and brought it to the table and set it down. She looked at Ida and then at her father. It's okay to put it out, Laurel said. I think it's okay now. Bennett looked at his daughter for a long moment. His eyes were bright. Thank you, Laurel, Ida said. Later, when the children were in bed, she and Bennett sat together by the fire the way they'd gotten used to doing, and he said she wouldn't have begrudged me this. I've been thinking that for a while, and I think I finally believe it. No, Ida said. I don't think she would have. I needed it to feel like something I had permission for, he said. Not just something I took, I know. He looked at her. I should have said more earlier. There's a lot I should have said. You said what you could, Ida said. I heard it. He was quiet for a while. I love you, he said finally. Just the words plainly, the way he did most things. I've known for a while. I wasn't sure it was fair to say it. Say it whenever you want, Ida said. I'll be here. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And outside the Alberta night was cold and clear and enormous. And inside the house was warm and small and full of the particular quiet that meant everyone was safe. She hadn't known, when she'd packed that carpet bag and gotten on the coach east, that this was where it would go. She hadn't known that she was capable of loving children that weren't hers, or building a life in a place she'd never heard of, or finding in a quiet, stubborn, slowly opening man, something that felt like the truest thing she'd ever known. She had survived her whole life. She had gotten very good at it. But survival and living were not the same thing. and she was only now learning the difference. The girl who'd been traded for a dead man's debt had become someone who set an extra place at the table, who taught Maisie words in a notebook, who split wood in the morning cold and argued with Laurel about the right way to lay a fire, who lay awake, sometimes just listening to the house breathe, and felt improbably and entirely that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Maisie still carried the wooden horse. She'd told Ida once in her quiet way that her mother had made it for her. Ida had said, "I know, it's a good horse." And Maisie had looked at it and then at Ida and said, very simply, "She would have liked you." Ida had held on to that. She held on to it still. Outside, the stars came out over the coulees, enormous and indifferent, and somehow also, in the way of the Alberta sky, completely her own. And inside, the fire burned, and the children slept, and Bennett's arm was warm and solid around her shoulders. And this improbable, cobbled-together, deeply unplanned life was the one she'd built with her own hands. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.